In Western diplomacy, nations win over other like-minded nations to build alliances to defend against common enemies. The Chinese Communist Party, however, believes that in order to achieve unity or build an alliance, fighting is required among allies. This idea came from a strategy established by Mao Zedong and is the theoretic basis of China's wolf warrior diplomacy. It is also the strategy China has adopted to manage relations with Europe. Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Lei. Welcome to Leisrealtalk. The West often can't comprehend the rogue behavior of China's wolf warrior diplomats. We think their poor manner is due to the lack of proper training or education, but no. Their behavior is intentional because it's part of the CCP's strategy for foreign relations. And this is most evident in Sino-European relations. When China's Consul General in the British city of Manchester assaulted a Hong Kong pro-democracy protester on the grounds of the Chinese consulate, the wolf warrior wasn't shy in admitting it. In an interview with Sky News,
the man is because he's abused my country, my leader. I think it's my duty
to pull his hair.
Yeah, I think any diplomats, if faced to such kind of the behavior.
From China's entire diplomatic mission in the UK to its foreign ministry to the central leadership, no one thinks the Consul General's behavior was inappropriate. Instead, they think this type of behavior is required in order to effectively carry out China's diplomatic strategy. The idea came from Mao Zedong's belief that no alliances can be achieved without fighting, and that fighting is good for unity. In a March 1940 speech to senior CCP leaders, to address strategies for dealing with the nationalists and the invading Japanese, he said, "Fighting is the means of unity, and unity is the result of fighting. If you seek unity through fighting, unity survives. If you seek unity through concessions, unity dies." Mao followed up and said that many of the party comrades didn't understand this strategy because they thought that fighting would break unity. But Mao's logic was that not fighting is a sign of weakness. He believed that only through effective fighting could the regime teach those who dared to be disruptive a lesson, so that they stop causing trouble and unite around the CCP. Beijing has adopted this strategy in its relations with Europe. It believes that in order to force Europe to side with the CCP instead of the United States, it must, from time to time, intimidate Europe and teach European leaders some lessons. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz's recent visit to China was a diplomatic victory for the CCP because the Chancellor was the first Western head of state to visit after the pandemic. To showcase the achievement, Beijing reheated an old deal with Airbus from 2019 that's worth $17 billion. However, on the same day of Scholz's visit, Chinese authorities pulled the pre-recorded opening ceremony address by European Council President Charles Michel at the 5th International Import Expo in Shanghai. The Chinese asked Michel to remove the part of his speech that criticized Russia's illegal war in Ukraine and calls for balanced trade relations with China, as well as calling for China to use its influence to stop Russia's war. But Michel refused to change his speech, and so it was scrapped by Beijing at the expo. In the ongoing competition with the United States, Sino-European relations have become extremely important to Beijing. The regime has studied its opponents carefully and observed at least two major weaknesses of the EU. First, the 27 member states are very different from each other. While the principle of unanimity is implemented in decision-making, this makes the EU's internal coordination very difficult. Secondly, although the EU, the United States, and China form a triad in competing economically, the EU is faced with two dilemmas. It wants to remain a close American ally while maintaining independence from the United States. It also wants to have close economic ties with China, while hoping to reduce dependency. Beijing took note that the EU is looking left and right, forward and backward, and can make a decision regarding its strategy concerning China. And Mao's good old strategy is CCP's best weapon to use in Europe. Beijing has adopted a two-handed approach of hitting and pulling to nudge Europe towards siding with China. If the CCP only hits and doesn't pull, the EU will be pushed into the arms of the United States. If it only pulls without hitting, the EU will be too difficult to bargain with. So how can the regime hammer away at the EU? Wolf warriors come in handy for this. Here are some of China's most famous wolf warrior diplomats who are known for their egregious behavior. Chinese Consul General in Belfast, North Ireland, China's ambassador to Sweden, and China's ambassador to France. Did you notice something they all have in common? All of them are based in Europe. You don't often hear about Chinese diplomats to the United States throwing temper tantrums. I haven't heard. They don't do it because it's not part of the CCP's strategy. The regime doesn't want to rough up the United States, but it does dare to do that to European nations. This is because deep down, the CCP doesn't respect the EU as a worthy opponent. For many years, the CCP has supported European integration to broaden its own international platform and gain economic and technological benefits. In recent years, it has supported the strategic autonomy of the EU in order to weaken U.S. hegemony and break Europe away from the United States. Beijing perceives Europe as being in a relative decline. Before the 1990s, China's GDP was less than that of Italy. In 2000, China's GDP was $1.21 trillion, which was about 17% of EU's GDP at $7.26 U.S. trillion. In 2021, China's GDP was 17.73 trillion, surpassing the EU for the first time after Brexit. The EU has an area of 2.42 million square kilometers, while China is 9.6 million square kilometers. The EU has a population of 350 million, while China has 1.3 billion. From the CCP's perspective, EU is much smaller than China in both size and population. Its development potential is less than that of China. Beijing also believes that it is far ahead of Europe in transitioning to digital society. And more importantly, Beijing believes that the war in Ukraine will further weaken Europe. These are the reasons why Beijing dares to deploy more hits than pulls through wolf warrior diplomacy as part of its Sino-European strategy. So is this strategy working? I think to some extent it has been, especially if we look at Germany. There are many people in Europe who feel that the EU is locked into a relationship with China and that it's impossible to decouple. But if the relationship doesn't work and the values are different, why can't you break up and move on? Then how should Europe handle the CCP? The best response is to be fearless and unwavering in sticking to your principles. You don't have to be confrontational in return. But the type of people the CCP fears the most are the ones who have principles. Here are the two videos I made on the subject. That's all for today. Thank you for watching. See you next time.